Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, Boris Johnson's schedule was changed last night so he could join Theresa May on the 7-hour flight back from New York. This morning, as I speak, in fact, the Prime Minister is holding a special cabinet session to outline tomorrow's big speech on Brexit. After several days of rumours about cabinet splits, Boris has denied any disharmony, describing the group as a nest of singing birds. But is the cabinet singing the same tune, or should the Prime Minister be worried about a cuckoo in the nest? Talks of cabinet splits were ignited last week when Boris Johnson published a 4,000-word article of his vision of Brexit, resurrecting the Leave campaign's claim of giving a lot of the £350 million a week he says will be saved by leaving the EU to the NHS. Environment Secretary Michael Gove tweeted his support, saying debate around Brexit should be forward-looking on how to make most of life outside the EU. And the Sunday Telegraph reported that both Mr Gove and International Development Secretary Priti Patel were solidly with Mr Johnson, with both backing his plan to spend more on the NHS. The Times reports that prominent Leave campaigners Liam Fox and Andrea Leadsom also flocked to Mr Johnson's side. However, the Foreign Secretary's manoeuvring has caused some in the Cabinet to fly into a fury, including Brexit Secretary David Davis, who found the £350 million claim hard to swallow. A source reported that Davis thinks Boris was wrong to revive it. Home Secretary Amber Rudd and First Secretary of State Damien Green were swift to defend the Prime Minister, parroting the line that it's the job of the Cabinet to get behind the Prime Minister. Also nesting in with the Prime Minister is Chancellor Philip Hammond. One of his allies told the Mail on Sunday this just confirms suspicions about Boris's ambitions, adding that it is disloyal and damaging for the party. Despite the furore, it appears to be water off a duck's back to Mr Johnson, who said on Tuesday that he is mystified by all this stuff. So will Theresa May clip Boris's wings and restore the cabinet pecking order, or could this be the beginning of her swan song? Yes, I think we've got enough bird jokes in there. For the latest, let's join our political correspondent Chris Mason in Downing Street. Chris, can you hear singing from behind the black door?
My ear has been tilted towards that black door for now 2 hours and 7 minutes, and no tweets heard as yet. But what we do know is whatever is going on behind that black door, tweeting or otherwise, there's rather a lot of it to get through, because cabinet meetings do not tend to last this long. About 10 to quarter to 10, Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, rolled up here in the street, looking every inch the man who'd spent a night on a transatlantic flight. But then again, that hair is rarely perfectly combed. And yes, there was a flurry of all of the other cabinet ministers as well, all remaining tight-lipped as we shouted questions in their direction. And the Prime Minister presenting her speech, or at least the very latest draft of it, to the Cabinet. For some of them, the first time they've seen the whole of that speech, and she has to square it with her Cabinet before trying to hope that in the big pitch in Florence tomorrow it does enough to act as a catalyst to kick on the talks with the European Union. So a tricky old business, really.
Yes, and you mentioned the flight that Boris Johnson took back from New York. Of course, he shared it with the Prime Minister. Do you think they cracked open a bottle of wine together, or did they sit in silence and go to sleep?
Shared a bag of peanuts, perhaps, you know, yeah. You do wonder, don't you, exactly what the conversation must have been like at 37,000 feet or whatever it was on that RAF Voyager flying back from New York to London this morning. That hadn't been the original plan as far as Boris Johnson's itinerary was concerned, his return flight, but given that they were both having to leave New York at roughly the same time and were both due around the same table in central London at the same time this morning, it did kind of make sense that they would share the same flight. You can understand my twitchiness every time that door opens, because when you've stood in the street for 2 hours, 10 minutes, you just tend to get excited every time the door does.
Yeah, we'll be keeping an eye on it.
No sign of it opening as yet.
We'll keep an eye on that door for you, Chris. Don't worry, I shall be shouting at you if anybody comes out who was sitting around that cabinet table. Now, the Prime Minister, as you said, is seeking the backing of the cabinet for the speech in Florence. Do you understand if it's been rewritten dramatically?
I think it's gone through a good number of drafts. We know, don't we, because there was that snap taken here in the street about a week ago of a draft being held by Ollie Robbins, the now former Permanent Secretary, Chief Civil Servant at the Department for exiting the European Union. He's shifting across to the Cabinet Office to work more closely with the Prime Minister. So we know a draft was circulating around about that time, prior to Boris Johnson committing rather a lot of ink to rather a lot of paper in the Daily Telegraph last Saturday. In all likelihood, several other drafts have been kicked around in the last week, and it is entirely possible, given the genre of political speech writing, that the writing will continue right up until the final moment, but perhaps only finessing some of the details as a result of the Cabinet meeting, rather than necessarily a whole hasty rewrite. The central challenge for the Prime Minister, beyond keeping her Cabinet on board, is then this whole issue, as I say, of kicking forward the talks in Brussels. Because you remember the central dynamic there is that Brussels wants to see progress on these three areas that are being looked at the moment, the Irish border and citizens' rights and the divorce bill, before there's a movement on to talking about the future relationship and the trading relationship. In other words, Brussels wants to see talk about money before it talks about the future. There's plenty around the Cabinet table, including the Prime Minister who's hinted at this, that want to be able to talk about the future at least at the same time as talking about money, if not before. And so there'll be a hope that what she has to say tomorrow allows some sort of sense that kind of progress can be made sooner rather than later on those things that are currently on the table. Right,
well, we're going to let you go and concentrate your focus and gaze on that black door, because it's obviously going to be a marathon Cabinet meeting, and we may speak to you later on. Here in the studio is the Conservative MP Kit Morehouse. Welcome to the studio. You must have travelled on a few planes with Boris Johnson in your time working with him when he was mayor.
Yeah, a couple of times we went overseas. We had a very successful trade mission to China, where I didn't fly out with him, but flew back with him, yes.
And what's he like on a plane? Does he like to just go to sleep, or was he chatting all the way?
Yeah, we all slept. It was an overnight flight back, so we were all fast asleep. He was very, very active, as I recall, in China. I mean, he's a brilliant person to travel with. And, of course, went down very well, and that contributed to some of the financial success that we're seeing in London now. Right, have you, enormous Chinese investment in London. Have you spoken to him over this furore regarding his vision on Brexit? No, not before or since. No, I haven't. And to be honest with you, I'm slightly surprised at the level of furore, I guess. Some of us wrote a not dissimilar article in the Telegraph at the start of the summer, which amazingly was unreported.
But he's the Foreign Secretary, I suppose, not wanting to demean your position in any way.
And I slightly I guess, don't understand quite the furore, given that his piece was largely kind of on message and reinforcing everything that the Prime Minister has said so far. I guess it looked to me like he was trying to inject a bit of fizz into the debate. And one of the frustrations, I mean, I voted Leave. One of the frustrations, I guess, that those of us on the Leave camp have is that the kind of overwhelming narrative about Brexit in the media has been almost entirely negative, and we need to recapture that sense of idealism about what the opportunities that Brexit holds for us.
Is it just the responsibility of the media? I mean, Theresa May hasn't exactly been enthusiastic about Brexit, or hasn't voiced it publicly, nor have other members of the Cabinet. So do you think that has contributed to Boris's frustration? Yeah, I think probably, and I would hope that the speech tomorrow, and it is a seminal moment, everybody's quite right to concentrate on it and talk about how it's being drafted and all that stuff, because it is going to be very important. And I do hope she tries to capture some of the sense of idealism, as I say, an opportunity that Brexit presents, not just for us, but for the rest of the world, with whom we are able to engage much more freely now. Has she been too downbeat about Brexit? I don't think necessarily downbeat. I'm just not sure that the optimism of it has cut through. I mean, you've got to remember, the government and senior ministers are dealing with what is an incredibly complex negotiation. And in that complexity, when you're deep in the weeds of, you know, reciprocal healthcare and access to confidential papers and goods in the market, it's quite hard to forget that it's quite easy to forget, sorry, that the public needs some kind of idealistic vision presenting to them about what the collective mission is. Are you optimistic about Brexit?
I'm not optimistic about it, nor do I see this idealistic vision. Actually, perhaps Kit and I agree about that, although he thinks there is one and I don't think there
Why not?
is one. Well, I see this as the beginning of a long, slow, no great Armageddon moment, but long, slow decline into insularity and irrelevance. The great tragedy is that it's quite clear the government itself is completely split about this. And I guess we're destined to go on like this for the next 4 or 5 years. I don't know how long Boris is going to last in the cabinet. He's got quite a low boredom threshold, I think, so he may find being Foreign Secretary and is a bit boring for him.
Right.
Most people wouldn't find that, I have to say.
Right.
See, I have to confess to be mystified by that attitude from. I mean, Chris is a long-standing socialist, you know, and quite rightly so, if those are his beliefs and all the rest of it. And to see yourself as allied to this essentially corporatist racket, which is quite obviously declining in economic importance, certainly in terms of share of world trade, where young people in the southern half of the EU have been thrown on the scrap heap for 2 generations now by the demands of central banking union. I'm amazed. I mean, we all know that, you know, McDonnell, Corbyn, all those people voted against the EU again and again and again for 30 years. And I'm surprised at that you don't see at least the opportunity to battle.
Are you betraying left-wing socialist thought on this?
I don't think I am, no. I think most Labour supporters are actually overwhelming in favour of remaining in the EU, if only. I don't disagree that things need changing in the EU, but it's a hell of a risk to take, jumping over the cliff edge when it constitutes such a large part of our relations with the outside. Well, now, if you think you can make it all up by deals with China and India and America, good luck to you. But I personally am sceptical.
Well, and there's been talk about 20 billion euros being mooted in this speech, or certainly an amount that Theresa May is going to make a sort of generous and open offer. Do you think that's the right thing to do in tomorrow's speech, to try and unlock the negotiations?
Well, I think it's worth making some kind of an outline offer, yes. I mean, you know, you quite rightly posited the fundamental problem with the negotiation, which is the EU wants to see the money first,
yep,
and we want to see what we're buying first. And in the end, the truth is, as said before, nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. So it's perfectly possible for the Prime Minister to give a kind of outline region in which we're willing to pay. But until we get to the end and we see what the full deal is, there's no reason that can't be changed. So if we get to the end of
So it could be more, in fact.
Well, it could be less. So we might get to the end of the negotiation and we say, right, let's talk about the free trade agreement. And they say, well, do you know what? We're not going to allow Stilton and pork pies onto the continent. And we'll say, well, OK, we're not going to pay 20 billion then.
But what do you
that would be the iteration at the end.
What do you make then of the sentiment that has come out of Number 10, reports that the UK will pay an amount to ensure the EU is not out of pocket? I mean, the EU is going to be out of pocket when we leave because we're a net contributor, unless, of course, we are going to pay an amount to the EU in perpetuity.
Well, my assumption is they're talking about the current budget timetable up to whatever it was, 2022, I think is the current budget.
2020.
2020, sorry. So from my point of view, as somebody who voted leave, what I would like to see is not just a figure plucked out of the air. I'd like to see a kind of scientific reasoning about why we're paying what we're paying.
Right.
Now,
do you think 20 billion has been plucked out of the air?
Well, I don't know. I haven't seen the methodology. I mean, there is this fabled meeting, apparently, where one of our civil servants took apart the claims of the EU to larger numbers and looked at it legally and forensically. But don't forget, we also have a share of large assets in the EU. We're a shareholder in the EIB. That's worth 10 billion quid.
So should we
be
be ensuring that the EU is not out of pocket?
Well, we should ensure that the settlement is a fair one, both in terms of the scientific methodology of calculating it, but also, frankly, ethically. I'm for an ethical exit, in that these are our friends and partners. We don't want to exit on the basis that it causes them problems, on the basis that they don't want to cause us problems. If that means that a bit of money in the system will lubricate that, then that's fine by me. It also, we have to talk about how long we would pay it over.
Right, well,
right? So
are you happy for it to
borrow a lot of money for your house. If you had to pay it on day one, then you wouldn't buy the house, but you pay it over 25 years.
But we are now entering the sort of third round of negotiations, or it is going to be happening in October, and arguably no one knows what Britain's actual position is on the shape of Brexit.
Well, I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, we've now issued quite a lot of position papers about detailed areas of Brexit.
Have you read
that
those?
need to be good. I've read a few of them, yes. I haven't, to be fair, read them all.
I've read a few of them.
They had a very good one on science and innovation a couple of weeks ago, which I wrote, which was brilliant. Emollient, cooperative, looking for a constructive relationship, and I think the rest of them, certainly the ones I've read, have been in the similar tone.
Do you think Boris blinked over the sort of talks, if you like, with Theresa May, that in the end he has backed down and he will be standing loyally beside her in Florence tomorrow?
I haven't heard or seen anything from him that's been anything other than loyal. Now, I know that it was August. A lot of the reports that we're getting in the paper and here are all sources close to, senior friends of. I have no idea who these people are.
Right.
So I'm unable to judge.
So you don't think he'll walk at any point?
I'd be very surprised if he did, yeah.
Right. I mean, in terms of how this speech is going to be received tomorrow, do you see it as a seminal moment, or actually do you think much will change?
I see it as an interesting moment, and hopefully she will put a bit of flesh on the bone. I don't disagree with anything Kit said about our need to make an ethical exit. Presumably we will have one or two long-term obligations, such as EU pensions, but I don't think that will be controversial either. So I don't see why some sort of settlement shouldn't be reached, though there is a wing of Kit's party especially, not only them though, that is unlikely to be happy with almost any amount spent on the separation. And I've no doubt they'll give trouble in due course, if they're not already.
I have to confess, I haven't come across anybody really who thinks that. I mean, there are certainly people who think we should pay, you know, absolutely scientifically what we're entitled to. And of course, there is this slightly strange...
well, Boris Johnson did say at one stage, go whistle on the money altogether.
He said go whistle about 100 billion, to be fair. That was when 100 billion was being bandied around. I mean, there is this slightly strange idea that we should pay for access to the single market. That's where there will be some dispute. Now, of course...
Do you think we should?
Well, no, because paying for access to the single market is when you pay for access to somebody's market, it's called a tariff. And so to pay a lump sum in exchange for no tariff seems bonkers to me. We should think about having a free trade arrangement where they have access to our market.
Although Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, has said it should be jobs first, and it should avoid a shutdown on immigration. And if that means paying for access to the single market, that would be fine.
But we don't have to pay for access to the single market. We're WTO members, so are the EU. If we left the WTO terms, we get access, same as the Americans and the Japanese and all the others get access. The idea of paying a lump sum to be able to trade is why we would have tariffs.
Kit Malthouse, thank you very much.
Now, the Prime Minister briefed her cabinet today on how she hopes to break the deadlock in the Brexit negotiations. That meeting took a marathon 2.5 hours. But before she could get to Italy to make her speech for tomorrow, the EU negotiator Michel Barnier appeared before a committee of the Italian Parliament to warn that Britain needed to hurry up and clarify its position on a variety of crucial topics before talks could progress. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Florence now. Gary.
I think we all know that Theresa May is not the sort of speechmaker who makes the hairs rise on the back of your neck. She wouldn't claim to be. I spoke to someone today who'd read the speech and they seem to have their emotions under control. What she does pride herself on being is a practical politician, and there is a practical purpose from her point of view to this speech. It is meant to unblock an impasse in the Brexit talks. The European Union is saying that Britain owes many billions of pounds on exiting the EU. The British government position is actually looking at your arguments, we don't think we do, but we're interested in a transition and we're willing to pay some money in for that. It's hoped that starts a conversation that could unblock the impasse. That's what she's hoping Europe will hear. It's big takeaway from tomorrow's speech, and that's what she was explaining today to her own cabinet. Back from New York in the early hours after a flight home with Theresa May.
Have you settled your differences with the Prime Minister?
What differences, the Foreign Secretary said. He'd been briefed in advance of today's Cabinet on what the Prime Minister is going to say in Florence tomorrow. He was one of the Cabinet Ministers working on Brexit who'd been briefed in advance of today's Cabinet on what the Prime Minister is going to say in Florence. Some Cabinet Ministers were getting their first glimpse of the speech. They were given 30 minutes to read it before Cabinet started. The Chancellor and the Foreign Secretary walked out together in a show of unity, though Brussels has been following the twists and turns of recent days closely and will take some convincing on that. When she speaks tomorrow in Florence, the EU capitals have been told to expect movement on the money they say we owe them for future spending we signed up to. Theresa May is expected to say we will pay to stay in many EU institutions in a transition period, but we don't accept the EU's list of debts outstanding. In principle, that's not a problem for some EU countries.
We know that there have been commitments by UK made back in 2012-2013 when we were negotiating multi-annual financial framework. So I would be very happy to see that we could move there if we can agree that we call it in a bit different way, or some specific interests of UK is kind of observed, then I would say we would be happy to support that.
But the 10 billion a year Britain is letting it be known privately it's willing to pay for each year it's in transition is way short of what the EU is demanding.
The key thing is that the amount that Britain pays is large enough to really cover what they claim it is owed, and I don't think that 20 billion euros, which is what's being floated, is likely to be enough, given the fact that they're asking for about 60 billion altogether.
Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, was up the motorway in Rome today, telling the United Kingdom to get a move on and speed up the pace of negotiations. On the eve of Theresa May's visit to Florence, he said there was still major uncertainty over many UK positions. But if the request for a transition period came in her speech here tomorrow, Britain should know it means obeying all the European rules for the whole duration. I think when you see a choreographed display of unity, as we saw today and as we're going to see tomorrow when some cabinet ministers like Boris Johnson come out here to listen to the Prime Minister, your antennae twitch a little bit at that choreography, and I think Brussels and other European capitals' antennae are twitching as well. There was a moment in Cabinet today when virtually the Cabinet dipped its hands in the blood of the speech. Everyone was asked to speak. Some ministers hadn't been heard from for a while, perhaps surprised to be summoned to speak. But the unity that she has achieved here is not massive, gigantic unity behind the central end point of Brexit. She's managed at some cost to get people unified for a moment or two, who knows for how long, about the transition that leads to the end state. She still hasn't got any sort of agreement on what that end state is, and I think one of the things that an awful lot of Europeans will be looking at tomorrow is whether there are any clues to that end state, and also how strong and stable, to borrow a phrase, Theresa May actually is. Will it be her the other side of the negotiating table beyond Christmas?
Gary Gibbon.
Theresa May will propose a transitional deal for the UK of up to 2 years in order to secure a smooth exit from the European Union. It's thought the plan could cost Britain £18 billion, but the final Brexit bill is likely to be higher. The Prime Minister is expected to make the offer in a key speech on Brexit in Italy tomorrow. Theresa May also wants continued access to the single market during that transition time, and for Britain to be able to negotiate its own trade deals. From Florence, our political editor Laura Koonsberg reports.
This city might be an escape from Westminster, yet the trickiness of our departure from the EU is no easier in a foreign language. And here on mainland Europe, as at home, threats to Theresa May lurk in many different corners. Before packing her bags, she had to try to get her cabinet on side. After 2.5 hours, an oh so natural display. Look, we all smile and agree.
Is Philip your new best friend?
Mr. Gork, is Cabinet united?
Very united. Very good. All behind the speech.
Mr. Cairns, will EU leaders like what they hear in Florence?
You'll have to wait and see.
We don't have to wait for all the detail, though. The Prime Minister is expected to say for the first time explicitly the UK will seek a transition deal that could be up to 2 years long after we leave the EU. She's likely to signal too she might be ready to offer 20 billion euros so that no other country loses out from Brexit. But after we leave, the Prime Minister will make clear again she wants a bespoke trade arrangement, not a model based on any other. Remember, in the referendum, Leavers promised that we would get money back. But after a visit to number 10, this prominent Eurosceptic sounds completely on board with paying, if only for a couple of years.
Mr. Jenkins, do you know what's in the speech?
We're leaving a big hole in their finances if we just leave. And if the European Union is going to deal constructively with us and reach a sensible agreement, well then there are reasonable political and diplomatic reasons why we should help them.
But in a transition, the EU's top negotiator has been firm we'd have to pay and play by their rules. saying there are still big uncertainties around our approach. In government circles, though, there's hope the speech can unlock the EU impasse. That's why the plans have been carefully kept under wraps.
And I have the British Prime Minister on the phone this afternoon. Don't tell the public, because the public will not be told.
But no more secrets on this speech tomorrow, on how decades of membership, ties of money, of politics, will start to be phased out. There's much still for Britain to decide, though, for the EU to discuss. This is still the overture before we finally depart.
Well, Laura joins us now from Florence. So a big speech tomorrow. How much do we know about exactly what the Prime Minister will say?
Well, Sophie, I understand that Theresa May will have a pretty strong message, actually, to the rest of the EU, basically saying that it's not just Britain, but also them right across the continent have a responsibility, basically, to crack on, to get on with it. And while it's not that surprising that she is going to, for the first time, explicitly acknowledge there will be a transition period, it is significant coming from her lips. Because what it does mean is that Number 10 is acknowledging publicly that there could be, for 5 years after the referendum, a long period of time where we are still paying into the EU and still playing by many of their rules. Now, of course, that's what business is desperate for. They want to have that time so we don't suddenly crash out, so new systems can be set up to minimise disruption. But politically, for many people who thought they might have been voting to leave the EU and get it over with, acknowledging transition is something that some members of the public might find difficult to stomach.
And with Brexit talks due to begin again next week, what impact could all this have on the sticking points?
Well, Sophie, the talks haven't just been at a sticking point, they've basically been at a brick wall, because the EU hasn't wanted to talk about the future relationship, because we wouldn't say that we would pay up. We wouldn't say that we would pay up unless the EU was willing to talk about the future. Now, with this offer going on the table, the hope in government circles is that Theresa May's intervention will be able to unblock that, to unstick it, to start smashing some cracks in that brick wall. But as far as the EU's concerned, talking about transition, that's something that's complicated in itself. And it's the same at home too. So there is so much to hammer out. The hope is at least the talks due to start again next week will be able to get going. They will be able to make some progress. But for some people, they're already 6 months in. We're still in the foothills of all of this.
Our political editor Laura Kunsberg in Florence. Thank you.
It has taken a while, but tonight we do have some clarity on the big political question of our age. You might call it Brexit delayed. In short, we are going for a transition period after the date of our formal exit, and we are prepared to pay for the privilege. Theresa May briefed her cabinet this morning, and it was smiles all round. Tomorrow, she will tell the rest of the European Union she wants to avoid a cliff edge at the date of our formal exit in March 2019. She hasn't put a figure on how much she's prepared to cough up, though the suggestion seems to be roughly what we pay now, around 10 billion a year. Her aim is evidently to clear the logjam in the talks and provide some clarity as to our intentions. But there is still plenty we don't know. Is she still asking to control our own laws and our own borders during any transition? And what about when we really do leave, whenever that may finally be?
Did you settle your differences on the plane?
After a 7-hour flight back from New York with the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson didn't look like a man at war over Brexit. He arrived for Cabinet along with his colleagues this morning to be briefed on what his boss is going to tell the rest of the EU tomorrow. They read drafts of her speech before emerging hours later.
Well, after more than 2 hours, ministers are finally leaving Cabinet, presumably fully briefed on what the Prime Minister will say in her big Brexit speech. And in a week where news has been dominated by rifts and tensions within Cabinet over Brexit, she's going to be hoping that she can pull them together and they'll be fully behind her tomorrow.
They certainly appeared together. Mr. Johnson leaving with the Chancellor was a deliberate show of unity. It was, said one Cabinet Minister, a cordial affair.
Is Cabinet united?
Very united. Very good. All behind the speech.
So what will Theresa May say? In an attempt to end the deadlock on negotiations, she'll reassure the EU the UK will meet its financial obligations. She'll signal the UK is willing to pay around £10 billion every year for at least 2 years after we leave in 2019. and asked to retain access to European markets, meaning businesses won't be hit with new tariffs and customs checks. But continuing to pay billions of pounds to the bloc post-Brexit won't please some within Mrs May's own party. They want her to maintain a tough position with the EU.
She's got to lay out what the British people voted for in a way that I guess is the European Union understands. So as long as it's, ending free movement, not paying billions of pounds to the EU, making our own laws in our own countries, being judged by our own judges, if she does that, I think that's a pretty good job done.
This former Chancellor warns against giving too much significance to tomorrow.
I think it's wrong to expect too much of this speech. In fact, I wouldn't expect the unexpected. You can't do negotiation by speech. No one would attempt to do that. So this is really positioning. The negotiations will continue on a detailed basis.
She does have a very difficult balancing act to perform, though. It's not just her cabinet she has to appeal to, but EU leaders as well.
And the problem for her is that both of them want different things. The hardline Brexiteers want to hear that she hasn't sold the pass on Brexit, and she is actually going to deliver it. The European Commission wants to hear that she's done enough to go through to the next round of negotiations. Very different audiences, very different messages, very difficult to spread the chasm there.
Tonight, it appears the Prime Minister does have her cabinet on side. The question is, after tomorrow, will the EU also play ball? Emily Morgan, News at 10 in Westminster.
As Emily said, Mrs May doesn't just have to carry her cabinet with her. She has to try as best she can to persuade the other 27 members of the EU to agree to her approach. That she has chosen to make this big and important speech in Florence has led to some puzzled looks from our European neighbours. It is, of course, the home of the Renaissance and, as it happens, Machiavelli, but that is surely a coincidence.
When the sun rises over the medieval glories of Florence tomorrow morning, there will be plenty on the continent hoping a new day will bring with it a new start in the whole painful Brexit process. Theresa May has chosen the city of the Medicis, once the greatest financial and trading centre in Europe, to throw more light on her vision of Britain's relations with the EU post-Brexit. It's a choice the mayor here believes is no accident.
This city is a city of bridges, not a city of walls. So our tradition is to project and to keep very open relations and international relations.
And you think that may have played a part in her choice to come here?
I hope it.
Florence taught the world a thing or two about the exercise of naked political power through the writings of this man, Niccolo Machiavelli, who advised princes, rulers, even prime ministers. But is there a latter-day Machiavelli working behind the scenes in Downing Street, trying to turn around the British negotiating position? Machiavelli would undoubtedly have recommended Mrs May put dissidents in her cabinet to the sword. Instead, she's taken a softer, more inclusive approach. But an outbreak of love at home may not cut much ice abroad. A bespoke deal somewhere between Norway and the single market and Canada with its free trade deal is what she'll ask for. The EU's negotiator Michel Barnier, also on a visit to Italy, gave that short shrift this afternoon. It's not possible to have the same benefits as the Norwegian model, but the limited obligations of the Canadian model, he said. Nor will the speech change the fact the EU still holds most of the cards.
The United Kingdom is the country that has decided to leave. It's the country that has triggered Article 50. Article 50 is time-bound. It's a very uneven, asymmetric negotiation.
Especially now that leaving with no deal seems to be completely off the table.
Well, I think leaving with no deal would be a catastrophe for the United Kingdom. It would be very bad for the EU, but the cost to the United Kingdom is a cost that no government should ever ask a society or economy to bear.
Europe will be listening carefully tomorrow, as much for a change of tone from London as for any major change in British policy. James Mates, News at 10, Florence.
And Robert Peston is here now. Well, James, talking about a change of tone there. But on the substance, we know we're now going to pay into the EU budget during a transition, but are we going to accept freedom of movement during that period? Are we going to accept the rulings of the European Court? What's your sense?
So a number of important points here. One is she does want us to remain in the European single market for the 2 years of transition. That means we will be subject still to the rulings of the European Court of Justice, which many of the arch-Brexiteers will hate. But there would be a registration system for immigrants from the rest of the EU from the formal moment of Brexit, which, as you know, is April 2019, and indeed those people who arrive after March 2019 here from the rest of Europe won't have the right to stay forever. So there will be restrictions on immigration. Now, the big question is, therefore, given that this is an attack on one of the fundamental freedoms of the single market, whether the rest of the EU will therefore give us a transition period, because they will say, well, if you're in the single market, you've got to accept free movement. Finally, and this is really important as well, yes, it's being seen, this payment, as payment for transition. It's not that. Theresa May is very clear that she's only going to pay money in the divorce to the rest of the EU if she gets an entire Brexit package accepted, including a future trade deal. So if they don't agree to a future trade deal, we won't have transition, we won't be paying money, and we will tumble out of the EU completely. So just to sort of reinforce the point, OK, no deal is still very much a possibility.
OK, and do we, you know, in essence, we're now talking about a longer period. I guess that's the headline of today. We're talking about transition. It's going to last...
If we get our way, because we're not necessarily going to get our way.
There. OK. Beyond that, in the final deal, any hints at all, or still that's really unclear as to what it might be?
No, I think it's pretty clear. I mean, actually, if I'm honest, I think this has been actually fairly clear since Lancaster House. We're not going to be part of the single market after those 2 years. We will if we stay in. If we stay in. If we get out with a deal, excuse me. If we will have something that looks quite a lot like the Canadian free trade deal. So not part of the customs union, elimination of tariffs, more freedom to negotiate with other countries, but much more costs and friction for British companies when they trade with the rest of the EU. It's a terrible technical term. We're looking for something called CETA Plus. That's basically, as I say, a slightly special version of the Canadian free trade deal. But I would like to stress this. Although she will not be waving the stick tomorrow, she still believes that no deal is better than a bad deal.
OK, we'll be talking about CETA Plus, I suspect, a lot. But now, for now, at least, Robert, thank you very much.
Theresa May gave her cabinet half an hour this morning to digest the speech she'll make in Florence tomorrow before she joined them at the lock-in. After that, they deliberated for a mammoth 2 hours. When Philip Hammond and Boris Johnson emerged practically glued together, it was as if the Foreign Secretary was a model team player. For the first time tomorrow, we'll know what Theresa May thinks Brexit means. We've had a few steers today. Sources have told the BBC that she's likely to propose a sum of potentially €20 billion for 2 years after Brexit to be paid into the EU budget, which would cover planned projects, conditional on continued access to the single market and potentially some form of customs union, which doesn't preclude the UK from striking its own trade deals. Our political editor, Nick Watt, is in Florence, ready for tomorrow. Nick, we're getting bits and pieces about their speech, but what have you been learning tonight?
Well, I spoke to one member of the Cabinet this evening who said to me, well, I wouldn't exactly describe this speech as a game changer, but look, they know it's really, really important. And so Theresa May will say tomorrow, the eyes of the world are on us, and by us she means the UK and the EU. She will say there is a profound sense of responsibility and that history will judge both sides badly if they fail. So what are we going to look for? Two big messages. There's the optics. The Prime Minister's coming to the birthplace of the Renaissance to say Britain wants to pay homage to European culture. Britain is leaving the EU, but it is not leaving Europe. It is still a European power. And on the substance, there are those 2 points that you were saying. One is she's going to talk about how the UK would like a time-limited implementation period. That's how she describes it, for no longer than 2 years. And that the UK will make a gesture to ensure that there's no black hole in the EU budget up to the end of 2020.
And what are the early noises in response from Brussels?
Well, Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, who has actually been in Italy, he will release a statement responding to the speech tomorrow. And essentially what they're saying in Brussels is, look, we're going to look really carefully at this. Lovely to hear you love the Renaissance in the UK, good news, but what we want is substance that is going to unlock these negotiations. And the part of the speech they're going to look at, be really interested in, is this transition phase. Prime Minister calls it the implementation period. What they're saying is that the UK has floated that idea before, but it's never formally requested it. So if Theresa May does that, that for Brussels is a big moment, and that will need to be referred to a discussion at the 27 member states. But big message they're saying, if you want to have a transition period, you have to be bound by the rules of the EU, but you don't have any votes.
Nick, thank you very much indeed. Well, Theresa May has two audiences tomorrow. First, the Brexiteers here at home, and second, the 27 other EU heads of state. In a moment, I'll be talking to the Conservative MP, Dan Hannan, one of the chief architects of the Brexit campaign, and from Rome to Roberto Galtieri, who's on the European Parliament's Brexit Steering Committee. But first, our policy editor, Chris Cook, has been looking at some of the more intractable issues.
Ahead of our Prime Minister's speech in Tuscany tomorrow, Michel Barnier spoke today in Rome. And he wasn't totally cordial about the UK. The Brexit talks are a little stuck right now. The key test for the Prime Minister to unblock the talks will be, can she make progress on the budget, on citizens' rights, and on the island of Ireland? That's the stuff we need nailed down to move on to trade talks. Where are we then?
So the big news tomorrow may be that we propose a 2-year transition period after we formally leave the EU. That would mean we'd remain members of the single market for that period, we'll be inside a customs union with the EU during that time, and we keep paying in much like we were members. The thing is though, even though that might mean we gave them quite a lot of money, it won't solve the budget issue.
Our paying in for a few years would cover some, but not all, of what Brussels think we owe.
The EU claims that Britain owes around 60 billion for obligations and commitments which it's already made as an EU member. Paying an extra 10 billion a year in 2019 and 20 will make a bit of a dent in that, but it's not going to solve the entire budget issue, no.
Ireland is a pretty intractable issue. How do you maintain a porous border between North and South and allow both the EU and the UK to have different customs policies and rulebooks? The Taoiseach suggested recently that maybe Britain should solve this by joining a customs union with the EU. In short, solve the problem by not letting Britain's trade policy diverge from the EU's.
If the United Kingdom doesn't want to stay in the customs union, perhaps there can be an EU-UK customs union instead. After all, the European Union has a customs union with Turkey.
What about citizens' rights? The EU 27 wants someone to guard the rights of their citizens in the UK. Our government doesn't want the European Court of Justice to do it. But a deal looks easier here than on Ireland.
The deal to be done on citizens' rights is fairly clear. Essentially, the UK and the EU sign a withdrawal treaty that lists citizens' rights in a lot of detail. And then there's a new bilateral court between the UK and the EU which citizens can go to if they think that the UK has discriminated against them.
These issues are the key tests. If the speech doesn't convince the EU 27 on them, the talks will remain exactly where they are.
That was Chris Cook reporting, where we're now joined in the studio by Daniel Hannan. He was one of the architects of the campaign to leave the European Union. And from Rome, the MEP Roberto Galtieri. He's the senior MEP who chairs the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee in the European Parliament and is also in the group that's scrutinising the Brexit deal. Good evening to both of you.
Good evening.
Daniel Hannan.
Good evening.
Theresa May blinked.
No, I wouldn't say that at all. She's always been very clear that she wants us to be the EU's strongest ally and best friend. She's putting flesh on what she said right at the beginning, which is we want a deep and special partnership. And to be honest, Kirsty, I don't really see how else she was going to interpret a 52-48 result. I mean, when you have a referendum that's that close, that's not a mandate to walk away. That's a mandate for a phased, gradual recovery of power.
Now, what she is apparently going to be offering at some point is this €20 billion figure 2 years after Brexit to take care of all the different EU commitments. The EU wanted €60 billion.
Britain has an interest in the security and stability of its European allies, right? The EU27 matter to us, their prosperity matters to us, if for no other reason than that wealthy neighbours make good customers. So all of these issues, the budgetary issue, the transition issue, should be seen in the context of us wanting a win-win outcome, because it's not just out of kindness, not just out of altruism, out of self-interest. We want the rest of the EU to succeed, and we should be entering the talks in that spirit.
Well, Roberto Galtieri, what does the figure, the possible figure of €20 billion for 2 years sound like to you? Is it enough?
No, we first need to agree on a method that allows us together to discuss figures. So far, the UK position has been a position of refusing, basically, the definition of a common methodology. We really look forward that tomorrow the speech of Prime Minister May will allow us to break this deadlock and to start discussing seriously on the financial settlement.
So the serious discussion of the financial settlement is that each party will have to move, and of course that doesn't take into account things like, you know, commitments on EU pensions and science deals and so forth. So it would be fair to say that that figure of 20 billion is going to move upwards.
Again, we are not yet in the phase of discussing figures. We have heard a very different position. Boris Johnson has denied any kind of commitment. We have heard about the moral commitment, legal commitment. So we need finally a clear position of the UK government, which would allow us to start negotiating, which we have not done yet so far in the financial settlement area, and makes really problematic so far the course of negotiation. So we really look forward in a very attentive mood and constructive mood to this speech tomorrow in order to pave the way for a serious negotiation, to give clarity to business, to citizens, and to minimize the disruption of Brexit.
But what we've heard, and of course you're part of the Brexit Scrutiny Committee, is that Guy Verhofstadt, who is on that runs that Brexit Scrutiny Committee, has rejected, apparently, according we're hearing to Sinn Féin, the 12 position papers that Britain put in over the summer. He has rejected those papers.
No, not at all. We are discussing first in a paper relating to a withdrawal agreement, because as everybody knows, the future relationship will be discussed in the second stage. Now we first have to make sufficient progress on the main pillars of withdrawal agreement. Here, for instance, on citizen rights, of course, we have differences with the UK position, but we are discussing, and we want to arrive at an outcome which will safeguard the rights of European citizens living in the UK or having lived, and UK citizens living or having lived in the Union.
Well, let me talk to Dan.
To safeguard the existing rights.
On that issue, I think the two sides are very close.
Well, I mean, the FT says, of course, that EU citizens are going to want recourse to the ECJ, and you're quite clear that sovereignty is an absolute red line for you.
But on the substance of not challenging not only the residents' rights, but their rights to welfare, their rights to healthcare, their rights to work and so on, that was clear throughout the referendum and has now been confirmed by the government. So if you want to write it into a treaty, fine. I mean, I don't think anyone seriously thought that we were going to start, deporting people who'd made their lives here. We're not Burma, for heaven's sake. I mean, it's extraordinary that we're even talking about
No, we're talking about the ECJ, and you've made it quite clear that you reject the ECJ as having any jurisdiction in the UK.
The problem with the ECJ throughout, and in a way the problem with the EU setup, is that it's the only one where you have a superior legal system that strikes down your national laws. And of course, it's very difficult to see how any future can retain that. But having taken back control doesn't mean that we don't then behave as a good neighbour, and we can replicate some of these things through bilateral treaties. The problem is, I just want to make one point, the problem is we've started on the trickiest subject. See, I think when we get onto trade, it'll be the first trade talks ever where you're beginning from a position of regulatory equivalence and zero tariffs. The argument was always going to be about the money. And it's, in a way, slightly unfortunate that we've got the sequencing in such a way that instead of making progress in other areas, we've started with the most intractable one.
Yeah, well, whose fault was that?
Well, that was the way it was decided to be sequenced. I mean, that was
Robert Galtieri, we're talking about whichever model we might actually pursue in the UK, what it'd be closest to. And one that seems to certainly has Daniel Hannan's backing is the Swiss model, that we actually do have partial access to the single market for goods, not services. We make bilateral deals, some of which take an awful long time to put together. And that every British citizen pays £53 into the EU, because that's what happens in Switzerland. Is that a model that would look good to you?
First, I would like to say, referring to the ECJ, that fortunately the UK very position on another paper is that it recognizes that there are agreements, the one with Moldova, others, which foresee a role for the ECJ. The role of interpretation of union law for us by the ECJ is essential. Another thing is the enforcement. We can discuss of some bilateral bodies. Relating to the single market, there are basically two models. The one is the Norway model, where you are within the single market. Another is a free trade agreement like the one of Canada. Of course, the free trade agreement can be negotiated in different ways, and then there is finally the issue on whether the UK will stay within or outside the customs union. So we are open to discuss all these issues, but of course we cannot mix things. A single market is a holistic concept. Either you are in or we are out. We would really welcome a UK decision
I'm not
to
sure that's
stay in the
actually
single
true.
market.
The single market is not a
Yes.
single entity. The single market is an agglomeration of lots of different responsibilities, some of which are uncontroversial. I mean, I think the real basis of the single market is the rule that says that you can't discriminate against goods or products from another country on grounds of nationality. Now, I'd be perfectly happy to keep
you
that.
get tariffs.
No, I don't think there's a single country in Europe except Belarus that faces tariffs. I mean, every non-EU country, there are 19 members of the Council of Europe outside the EU, none of them faces tariffs, so that's a kind of non-issue. But, the Swiss actually, are they in the single market? It depends how you define it. They're outside the jurisdiction of the ECJ, but through domestic law, they replicate quite a lot of the content. Do you know what? I can't help noticing they're doing pretty well, the Swiss, and 80-odd% of them don't want to join the EU.
Without crossing your fingers and toes, do you really think the Cabinet's united on this?
Yes. I mean, I think that the broad principle that we're going to be in a common market, not a common government, that we want the closest relationship with the EU compatible with being a sovereign country, and that goes beyond trade and encompasses military and defence and security links. Yes, I think that's common ground, not just to the Cabinet, but to the vast majority of Conservatives, and I think to the majority of the country.
Thank you both very much indeed.
I've been